I raised you to be quiet, not to question me, my mother said, setting her teacup down with a precision that made the small clink sound like punctuation, like the closing of a door I'd been standing in for 47 years. My name is Diane. I'm 47 years old, and I'm a licensed family therapist with a practice in Richmond, Virginia, which means I have spent 20 years of my professional life teaching other people how to recognize the exact thing my mother had just done to me across her kitchen table, the deflection disguised as wisdom, the control disguised as care. I sat across from her in the house I'd grown up in, the same yellow kitchen with the same chipped enamel sink, and felt something I hadn't let myself feel in this room in decades, the specific, electric sensation of a question finally leaving my mouth instead of dying quietly in my chest the way questions always had in this house. I'd asked her something simple, on the surface. My daughter, Lily, 16 years old and pulling away from me in ways that felt achingly, frighteningly familiar, had said something the week before that lodged itself under my skin and wouldn't dislodge. You always say you want me to talk to you, Mom, but every time I actually do, you get this look like I'm doing something wrong. I'd sat with that accusation for days, turning it over, recognizing something in it I didn't want to recognize, and finally, sitting across from my own mother, I'd asked the question that had apparently been waiting 40 years to be spoken aloud. Why did you always shut me down when I tried to talk to you about anything real? My mother had looked at me with an expression I knew intimately, the particular stillness she wore when a conversation moved somewhere she hadn't authorized it to go, and delivered her answer like a verdict. I raised you to be quiet, not to question me. I am a professional. I have sat in rooms with families unraveling generational patterns far more visibly destructive than mine: addiction, abuse, abandonment. I know, intellectually, exactly what a sentence like that reveals about the person who says it. I know the fear underneath the control, the inherited silence beneath the demand for silence. Knowing that didn't stop my hands from going cold around my own teacup. I smiled at my mother that afternoon. I said something light, something about how times had changed, how kids today communicate differently, and I watched her visibly relax, watched the conversation slide back onto the familiar rails it had run on for my entire life, pleasant, contained, nothing said that couldn't be unsaid. But driving home that evening, gripping the steering wheel through Richmond's early evening traffic, I understood that something fundamental had shifted, quietly and irreversibly, in that yellow kitchen. I had spent my entire career helping other families name the patterns they'd inherited without choosing them. I had never once turned that same clear, professional attention on my own family, not really, not all the way down. I was about to. And I didn't yet understand how far down that question would take me. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what came before, not just my mother's silence, but the particular shape of the relationship that silence had built, brick by brick, across nearly 5 decades. My mother, Eleanor, was 74 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who had spent 31 years managing classrooms of other people's children with what everyone described as remarkable patience and warmth. That description always struck something complicated in me, because the patience and warmth she brought to her students rarely extended, in the same generous measure, to her own children. It wasn't that she was cruel. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters in this kind of story. My mother never raised her voice, never said anything overtly unkind. The control in our house operated through subtler mechanisms, a closed-off topic here, a redirected conversation there, an expectation, never stated outright but always understood, that certain things simply weren't discussed. Feelings that ran too deep. Disagreements that lasted too long. Questions that probed beneath the surface of how things appeared. My older brother Paul and I grew up fluent in this unspoken language. We learned, the way children learn anything essential to survival, which subjects were safe and which would earn us that particular stillness in our mother's face, the stillness that meant a conversation was over whether we'd finished saying what we needed to say or not. I had always told myself this was simply my mother's temperament. Reserved. Private. A product of her generation, her own upbringing, the particular brand of stoic Virginia womanhood she'd been raised inside. I built an entire professional understanding of family dynamics around recognizing these patterns in other people's histories while leaving my own conveniently, comfortably unexamined. There was a moment, early in my career, I must have been 28, newly licensed, sitting across from a client whose mother had used almost the exact phrase "mine favored," some variation of "that's not something we discuss," when something in my chest had tightened so sharply I'd had to excuse myself briefly from the session. I told my supervisor afterward that I was simply moved by the client's story. I didn't examine, then, why a stranger's childhood had landed inside my own body with such force. That's the kind of detail you file away and call professional sensitivity. It would be years before I understood I'd been recognizing something, not just sympathizing with it. For most of my adult life, my relationship with my mother had settled into something that looked, from the outside, like a perfectly functional adult bond. We spoke on the phone every Sunday. I visited every few weeks, brought Lily over for dinners that were pleasant in the specific, slightly effortful way that pleasant things can be when everyone involved has tacitly agreed not to disturb the surface. The unease, when I look back now, had been building for years before that conversation in the kitchen, not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small frictions I'd trained myself to absorb without examining. Lily had started pulling away from me about a year earlier, somewhere in the difficult terrain of 15 turning 16, and I'd watched it happen with a particular kind of professional anxiety. I understood, intellectually, that some withdrawal was developmentally normal, that teenagers needed to individuate from their parents in order to become themselves. But there was something in the specific quality of Lily's withdrawal that troubled me in a way I couldn't fully name. She wasn't just pulling away toward independence. She was pulling away from me, specifically, in moments when I most wanted her close, closing her bedroom door a beat too quickly when I tried to ask how her day had gone, giving me carefully edited versions of her life that felt, increasingly, like the same careful editing I'd learned to perform with my own mother. I noticed this. I want to be honest about that. I noticed the pattern for months before I let myself really look at it. I'd catch myself, in conversations with Lily, doing something that disturbed me on some preverbal level, a flicker of discomfort when she pushed too hard on a question I didn't want to answer fully, a subtle redirection when the conversation moved somewhere uncomfortable, a stillness in my own face that I only recognized, weeks later, because I'd spent a lifetime watching that exact expression on my mother. I didn't examine this connection directly. Not yet. I told myself Lily's withdrawal was simply adolescence, that my own occasional discomfort was simply the normal anxiety of parenting a teenager through difficult terrain. There was a Tuesday evening, about 8 months before the conversation in my mother's kitchen, when Lily came into the kitchen while I was making dinner and said, almost experimentally, testing the water, "Mom, can I tell you something kind of heavy?" And I remember this with a clarity that still unsettles me, the half-second of something tightening in my chest before I arranged my face into careful openness and said, "Of course, sweetheart, anything." She told me about a difficult situation with a friend, something involving exclusion and cruelty in her friend group, and I listened, and I responded with what I believed at the time was full attention and warmth. It was only weeks later, replaying the conversation, that I remembered the half-second before my face rearranged itself, the flicker of "please don't let this be something I don't know how to handle," and understood that some part of me had braced before she'd even finished her sentence, the exact same bracing I'd watched, my entire childhood, settle over my own mother's face. I didn't ask myself, in that moment, where that bracing had come from. I simply noted it, filed it away as an interesting observation about my own parenting anxiety, and moved forward without examining it further. Paul, my brother, lived 40 minutes away with his own family, and our relationship had settled, over the years, into something cordial but not especially close, holiday gatherings, occasional check-in calls, the kind of sibling relationship that functions adequately without ever venturing into deeper territory. I'd always attributed this distance to simple personality differences. Paul had always been quieter than me, more private, more inclined to let things lie rather than examine them. There was a moment, about 6 months before the kitchen conversation, at a family barbecue at Paul's house, when our mother made a comment, light, almost throwaway, about how Paul had always known how to leave well enough alone, unlike some people, with a glance in my direction that I absorbed with my usual practiced smile. Paul had laughed along, but I noticed something pass across his face afterward, something I couldn't fully name at the time, not quite discomfort, but a kind of weary recognition, as if he'd heard this particular comment, or some version of it, many times before and had simply stopped reacting to it visibly. I didn't ask him about it. I told myself it was nothing, simply our mother's familiar habit of subtle comparison between her children, a dynamic I'd absorbed so completely over the years that I barely registered it as remarkable anymore. That barbecue stayed with me anyway, in the way certain ordinary moments do, not as something I consciously thought about, but as a low hum of unease that surfaced occasionally in quiet moments, when I wasn't actively trying to suppress it. I'd find myself, doing dishes or driving alone, returning briefly to Paul's expression, to that phrase, known how to leave well enough alone, and feeling something uncomfortable shift slightly beneath the surface of my understanding of my own family. I didn't pursue it. I had built a career, a marriage, a life, on top of a foundation I'd never fully examined, and some part of me understood, instinctively, that pulling too hard on any one thread risked unraveling more than I was prepared to lose. The unease that had been background noise for months moved into the foreground about 2 months before the kitchen conversation, triggered by something small enough that I almost didn't register its significance at the time. I was helping my mother clean out a hall closet during one of my Sunday visits, a task she'd been putting off for years, finally prompted by her doctor's suggestion that she consider downsizing eventually. Buried beneath old coats and boxes of Christmas decorations, I found a small cardboard box of photographs I'd never seen before, older than my own childhood, faded and curling at the edges. Most were unremarkable: my mother as a young woman, her own parents, people I didn't recognize at family gatherings decades before I was born. But one photograph stopped me: my mother, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing beside a woman I recognized as my grandmother, Eleanor's own mother, whom I'd met only a handful of times before her death when I was very young. In the photograph, my mother's small face wore an expression I recognized with a jolt of unsettling familiarity, the same careful stillness, the same practiced blankness I'd spent my entire life watching settle over her own adult face. I held that photograph for a long moment, something tightening in my chest that I couldn't immediately name, and asked, as casually as I could manage, what was Grandma Ruth like? My mother's hand stilled, briefly, over the box she was sorting. She was a woman of her time, she said, in a tone that closed the subject as completely as if she'd spoken the words aloud. Strict. Old-fashioned. We don't need to dig through all that. I let it go. I told myself, at the time, that I was simply respecting my mother's privacy, her evident discomfort with the subject. But I kept that photograph, slipped it into my bag without quite deciding to, told myself I'd return it later, and never did. The second fragment arrived a few weeks after that, during a conversation with my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, at a family gathering. Carol had always been more forthcoming than my mother, more willing to discuss the family's history with an openness that occasionally made Eleanor visibly uncomfortable. Carol mentioned, almost in passing, something about how strict Mother was with Eleanor, especially, being the oldest. You couldn't say a word in that house without her watching how you said it. I felt something land strangely in my chest, the same uncomfortable resonance I'd felt examining the photograph. Couldn't say a word without her watching. I asked Carol, carefully, what she meant. Oh, Carol said, with the easy unconcern of someone who doesn't realize she's handing over something significant. Mother had her own ideas about how children should behave, speak when spoken to, don't make a fuss, that kind of thing. Eleanor got the worst of it, being oldest. I think it shaped her more than she'd ever admit. She was always so careful with the two of you, wasn't she? Never wanted you kids to feel pressured the way she had. Carol smiled, clearly intending this as a compliment to her sister's parenting, not understanding the dissonance it created in me. Never wanted you kids to feel pressured the way she had. I sat with that sentence for the rest of the gathering, turning it over, trying to reconcile Carol's understanding of my mother's intentions with my own lived experience of growing up in that careful, contained house. I didn't bring it up with my mother. I told myself I needed more context before drawing conclusions, that one comment from Carol didn't constitute real understanding of a complicated family history. The third fragment was the hardest to set aside. About a month before the kitchen conversation, Lily came home from school upset, a minor conflict with a teacher, nothing serious, but she was clearly distressed and needed to talk it through. I sat with her, listened carefully, offered what I believed was genuine support. It was only afterward, alone in my own kitchen washing dishes, that I replayed the conversation and noticed something that disturbed me. At the most emotionally vulnerable point of Lily's story, when her voice had cracked slightly, I had, without consciously deciding to, gently steered the conversation toward practical solutions, away from the raw feeling underneath it. I'd done it smoothly, kindly, in a way that probably felt, to Lily, like helpful support. But I recognized the maneuver. I'd performed some version of it my entire life, watching my mother do exactly the same thing, not coldly, not cruelly, but with a kind of practiced redirection that moved conversations away from anything too raw before the rawness could fully surface. I stood at my sink that evening with my hands in dishwater gone cold, and felt something tighten in my chest that I could no longer file away as simple coincidence. I had pieces now: the photograph, Carol's comment, my own unconscious repetition of a pattern I'd spent my entire career helping other people recognize and break. What I didn't yet have was the willingness to put those pieces together and look at the whole picture. That came 2 weeks later, in my mother's kitchen, when Lily's accusation finally pushed its way out of my mouth as a question I could no longer keep swallowing. After the kitchen conversation, after my mother's answer landed and I smiled and changed the subject the way I'd been trained to for 47 years, I couldn't unsee what that exchange had revealed. I started sleeping poorly in a way that wasn't dramatic but was unmistakable, waking at odd hours with my mind already turning over fragments of memory I'd never previously examined with this kind of attention. I'd lie in the dark replaying scenes from my childhood I'd filed away as simply normal, moments of being gently but firmly redirected away from difficult feelings, conversations that had ended abruptly when they ventured somewhere my mother seemed to find threatening, the particular quality of praise I'd received, growing up, specifically for being easy, for not causing trouble, for being, as my mother had once described me to a neighbor within my hearing, no bother at all. I'd always heard that phrase as a compliment. Sitting awake at 3 in the morning, decades later, I heard it differently. I found myself, over the following weeks, doing something I'd never done before in earnest, actively researching the psychological literature on inherited silencing patterns, generational trauma transmission, the specific mechanisms through which parents who'd been emotionally restricted in their own childhoods often, without conscious intention, recreated similar restriction in their own children. I knew this material professionally, had taught versions of it to clients for years. I had simply never applied it, with full rigor, to my own family. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to the rest of this story. I had every professional tool necessary to examine this pattern months, even years, earlier. I had recognized echoes of it in my own reaction to clients' stories as far back as my 20s. I chose, repeatedly, not to turn that same clear attention on my own history, not because I lacked the capability, but because some part of me understood that looking directly at this pattern would require me to question not just my mother's parenting, but my own, and I wasn't certain I was prepared for what that examination might reveal about myself. I called Paul, finally, about 3 weeks after the kitchen conversation, not with any specific plan, just a need to talk to someone who'd grown up inside the same careful silence I was only now beginning to fully name. We met for coffee, and I asked him, directly, what he remembered about our mother's relationship with her own mother, whether he'd ever heard anything about Grandma Ruth that might explain the pattern I was beginning to trace. Paul was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee with more attention than the task required. "I've known some of this for a while, actually," he finally said. "Aunt Carol told me, years ago, when I was going through my own thing with Mom after Dad died. Grandma Ruth was harder on Mom than people talk about openly. There were, I don't know all the details, Diane, but there were things said, ways Mom was punished for talking back, for crying too long about things, for asking questions Grandma Ruth didn't want asked. Mom basically learned that staying quiet was the only way to stay safe in that house. I think she spent her whole life since then believing that's what good parenting looks like, protecting her kids from feeling too much, by teaching them not to show it." I sat with that for a long moment, my coffee going cold, feeling something shift permanently in my understanding of the woman who'd raised me. "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" Paul looked uncomfortable, genuinely so. "I don't know. I think I told myself it wasn't my story to share, that if Mom wanted you to know, she'd tell you herself. And honestly, Diane, some part of me just didn't want to stir things up. We've got a fine relationship with her now, mostly. I didn't see the point in disturbing that for old history neither of us can change." I didn't know it then, but Paul had been carrying more discomfort about this silence than he was admitting in that coffee shop. He told me, much later, what had actually been going through his mind during all those years of withholding what he knew. "I knew exactly what you were experiencing, Diane, because some version of it happened to me too, just expressed differently, the way it usually does between an oldest daughter and a son who learned early that staying out of the way was its own kind of safety. Every time you'd call after a difficult visit with Mom, frustrated by some new wall you'd hit, I'd think about telling you what I knew, and then I'd think about how much simpler it was to just let you keep believing this was simply Mom's personality rather than a pattern with an actual origin. I told myself I was protecting family peace. I think now I was protecting myself from having to sit with how much that inheritance had shaped both of us, not just you." I didn't yet understand the full weight of what Paul was carrying when we sat in that coffee shop. I understood, simply, that I now had something I hadn't had before: actual context, actual history, a thread I could follow back to its source rather than a pattern that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere in my own childhood. There was a moment, that same week, when I almost called my mother immediately, the question already forming: "Did Grandma Ruth do to you what you did to me? Is that the whole shape of this?" And I stood in my own kitchen with my phone in my hand, ready to dial, and then set it down. I told myself I wanted to approach this carefully, with full understanding, not as an accusation thrown without context. That was partly true. It was also true that some part of me was afraid of what confronting my mother directly might cost, not the relationship itself, exactly, but the comfortable story I'd told myself for decades about who she was and why. I spent the following 2 weeks gathering what I could, talking further with Carol, who, once she understood I already knew some of the history, became more forthcoming about details she'd previously kept vague, reading back through old family letters my mother had given me years earlier without comment, now visible to me in an entirely different light. A pattern emerged, clearer with each piece I gathered: my mother hadn't simply chosen control as a parenting philosophy. She had inherited it, fully formed, from a mother who'd taught her, through whatever specific mechanisms Carol still wouldn't fully detail, that silence was survival. I had proof now, or something close enough to it, not a single damning piece of evidence, but a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. What I still didn't have was the courage to bring it to my mother directly. That came on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after my coffee with Paul, when I drove to her house with every intention of finally asking the question I'd been circling for over a month. I sat across from my mother in the same yellow kitchen where, weeks earlier, she'd told me she'd raised me to be quiet, not to question her. This time, I came prepared, not with documents or evidence in any formal sense, but with the clarity that had been building in me since that first conversation, since the photograph, since Paul's coffee shop confession. "I want to talk about Grandma Ruth," I said, and watched something flicker across my mother's face, not quite alarm, but a recalibration, the look of someone whose carefully maintained surface has just been approached from an unexpected angle. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, reaching for her teacup in the same precise gesture I remembered from weeks before. "She's been gone almost 30 years, Diane. I don't see what good comes from digging up ancient history." "I think it explains something," I said, keeping my voice level, deliberate, the voice I used professionally when I needed a conversation to hold steady despite emotional pressure on both sides. "I think it explains why you shut me down whenever I tried to talk to you about anything real. I think Grandma Ruth did something similar to you, and you learned that silence was safety, and you taught me the same lesson without ever deciding to, the way these things usually pass down." My mother's hands had gone very still around her teacup. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and I recognized, in that silence, something different from her usual deflection. This wasn't redirection. This was refusal. She looked at me steadily, without shame, without the slightest flicker of apology, and let the silence stretch between us in a way that felt, somehow, more confrontational than any words could have been. "I'm not interested in rehashing my childhood for your professional curiosity," she finally said, and her voice had gone cooler, more distant. "I raised you and your brother the best way I knew how. If that wasn't good enough for you, I'm sorry, but I won't sit here and let you turn me into a case study." I felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to retreat, to soften this, to apologize for pushing too hard and let the conversation slide back onto its familiar, comfortable rails. I recognized the reflex fully this time, the exact pattern Lily had named in me weeks earlier, and for the first time in my adult life, I let it pass through me without acting on it. "I'm not trying to turn you into a case study," I said quietly. "I'm trying to understand why my daughter is starting to shut down with me the exact same way I learned to shut down with you. I'm trying to stop this before it goes any further, Mom." That's not an attack. That's me trying to break something before it breaks Lily the way it broke parts of me. Something moved across my mother's face at that, not quite vulnerability, but something adjacent to it, quickly smoothed over. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said, her voice still controlled but with a new, harder edge underneath it. "I can't go back and parent you differently. What's done is done. I don't see the use in this conversation." She stood, moved to the sink, began rinsing her teacup with movements that were deliberately ordinary, deliberately final, the physical equivalent of closing a door. I sat at the table for a long moment, watching her back, understanding that this confrontation, at least in this form, was over. She wasn't going to break down. She wasn't going to deny anything outright, either. She was simply going to refuse to engage further, and make it clear, through every line of her posture, that my questions had no power to move her. I didn't push further. I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me, that pushing harder in this moment would accomplish nothing except confirming, once again, the old pattern, me reaching for connection, her retreating into controlled distance. "Okay," I said quietly, standing as well. "I'm not going anywhere, Mom. When you're ready to actually talk about this, I will be too." I drove home that evening with a strange, settled kind of calm I hadn't expected, not victory, not resolution, but the specific clarity of having finally said, out loud, in that kitchen, the thing I'd spent 47 years not saying. I understood, fully, with no room left for doubt, that my mother might never give me the conversation I was hoping for. I understood that the relationship I'd believed we had, pleasant, functional, adequate, had always been built on a foundation neither of us had ever fully examined together. It was only that night, sitting alone in my own kitchen long after Lily had gone to bed, that everything I'd held steady in my mother's kitchen finally arrived in full, not as anger, but as a long, quiet grief for every version of connection we might have had if either of us had known how to ask for it sooner. My mother called me 11 days after that Sunday afternoon, longer than her usual pattern of reaching out, long enough that I'd begun to wonder if the silence between us had simply become permanent. "Can you come over?" she said, when I answered. Not a question, exactly, but not her usual brisk certainty either. Something in her voice sounded smaller than I'd heard it in years. I drove to her house that evening, uncertain what I'd find, and sat across from her in the same yellow kitchen for the third time in this unfolding story. She didn't reach for her teacup this time. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and after a long silence, she finally spoke, and once she started, it came out as something closer to a single unbroken current than the careful, measured sentences I was used to from her. "I need to tell you what actually happened with my mother," she said. "Not the version I've given you and Paul for 40 years. The real shape of it, even the parts that make me sound weak, because I think you deserve that now, even if I don't fully know how to give it to you. It started when I was very young, 6, maybe 7. I have one specific memory that I think is really the beginning of all of it. I'd fallen off my bike and scraped my knee badly, and I came inside crying, the way any child would, and my mother sat me down and told me, very calmly, that crying solved nothing and that I needed to learn to manage my feelings privately instead of making everyone around me deal with them. I remember thinking, even at that age, that something about this felt wrong, that I needed someone to comfort me, not instruct me. But she said it so calmly, so reasonably, that I told myself she must be right. That was the first lie I told myself, that her calm meant she was correct, and my distress meant I was the problem. After that, I learned quickly. Every time I tried to bring her something real, a fear, a sadness, a question about something confusing, I got some version of that same calm redirection. Eventually I stopped trying. I told myself this was simply maturity, learning to handle things myself instead of burdening others. I kept choosing that interpretation for years, long past childhood, because the alternative, admitting that my own mother had systematically taught me that my feelings were inconvenient, was too painful to sit with. By the time I had you and Paul, I genuinely believed I was protecting you from something. I thought, if I taught you to manage your feelings privately the way I'd learned to, I was giving you a tool, not a wound. I was so afraid, and I think this is the part I've never said out loud to anyone. I was afraid that if I let either of you express things too openly, too messily, I wouldn't know how to respond. I never learned that skill myself. My mother never showed me what it looked like to sit with someone else's pain without trying to manage it away. So when you'd come to me upset, some part of me would panic, quietly, and that panic would come out as exactly what my mother gave me: calm, controlled redirection, dressed up as wisdom. I knew, on some level, across all those years, that something wasn't right about how easily you and Paul stopped bringing me real things. I told myself it simply meant you were both well-adjusted, independent children who didn't need excessive hand-holding. I chose that story because the alternative, that I'd recreated exactly what had been done to me, was more than I knew how to carry. The moment in the kitchen, when you asked me why I'd raised you to be quiet, I knew, the second I said that sentence back to you, exactly where it came from. I'd heard some version of those words from my own mother more times than I can count. I said it to you anyway, instinctively, because in that moment of being questioned, that was the only language I had ready. I'm not proud of that. I think some part of me has known, for years, that I owed you and Paul a different kind of honesty than I've ever given either of you. I just didn't know how to start, until you forced the question into a room I could no longer redirect it out of. I sat across from my mother, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and felt something in my chest finally loosen that had been held tight for as long as I could remember. "Thank you for telling me," I finally said. "I'm not going to pretend this fixes everything overnight. But I needed to understand where it came from. I think Lily needs me to understand it too, not so I can blame you, but so I can actually stop it from going any further." We didn't resolve everything in that kitchen. I want to be honest about that. There was no single conversation large enough to undo 3 generations of inherited silence in one evening. But it was a genuine beginning, the first real conversation I could remember having with my mother in my entire adult life. In the months since, I've made deliberate, daily choices to parent Lily differently, not perfectly, not without occasional lapses into the old reflexive redirection I'm still learning to catch in myself, but with conscious intention I'd never applied before. When Lily comes to me upset now, I try to notice the bracing in my own chest before I act on it, and choose, deliberately, to sit in the discomfort of her feelings instead of smoothing them away. It's harder than it sounds. Some days I fail completely. But Lily has started talking to me more again, in small, tentative ways, and I've learned to receive those moments without rushing to fix or redirect them. My relationship with my mother remains complicated, not transformed overnight, not free of old patterns that still surface in unguarded moments, but genuinely different than it was before that first question in her kitchen. We talk now, occasionally, about things we never discussed before. It isn't easy for either of us. But it's honest in a way our relationship had never managed to be across 47 years. I am still a family therapist. I still sit across from clients untangling patterns passed down through generations who never chose them. But I do that work differently now, with a kind of grounded understanding I didn't have access to before I turned that same clear attention on my own family. I am not the woman who could recognize every pattern except her own anymore. I'm something else now, someone willing to look directly at the inheritance she's carrying, and choosing, deliberately, what to keep and what to finally set down. There's a particular kind of pattern that's hardest to see precisely because it doesn't look like harm from the inside, it looks like care, like protection, like a parent doing their reasonable best. I spent decades not examining my mother's careful silences because they were wrapped in calm rather than cruelty, and I understand now why that made them so difficult to question. Questioning them meant questioning the entire story I'd told myself about what good parenting looked like. Looking back, the photograph in that hall closet wasn't really the beginning, it was simply the moment I could no longer avoid what some part of me had already sensed for years, in my own unconscious repetition of my mother's exact redirections with my own daughter. I had pieces of this inheritance long before I had the full shape of it, and I understand now that I wasn't blind to those pieces so much as professionally skilled at examining everyone's patterns except my own. The real turning point wasn't the confrontation in the kitchen, where my mother retreated into silence rather than breaking open. It was the moment, days later, when she called and chose, finally, to tell me the truth instead of continuing to manage the distance between us. I had spent my whole life believing that love meant not disturbing the peace. What I learned, finally, is that real connection sometimes requires disturbing exactly that peace, deliberately, with care, in order to build something more honest underneath it. I think, too, about Paul's confession in that coffee shop, how much of his silence wasn't malice but a particular, recognizable fear of disrupting a fragile equilibrium none of us had ever consciously chosen. I understand that fear intimately now, because I carried a version of it myself for over a month before I found the courage to bring what I knew directly to our mother. What I learned, in the end, wasn't really about my mother, or even about Grandma Ruth's long-buried history. It was about how easily a family can mistake silence for safety, generation after generation, each one believing they're protecting the next from something, when actually they're simply passing the same unexamined wound forward, wrapped in new packaging. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this: notice when the people closest to you stop bringing you their real selves. Notice it in your children, notice it in yourself. You don't have to wait until you're 47, sitting across a kitchen table, to finally ask the question you've been swallowing your whole life. I hope you don't have to. But if some part of this story sounded familiar, if some part of you recognized the careful stillness that means a conversation is over before it's finished, let this be the moment you ask anyway. I'm not angry anymore, most days. I'm something quieter than that now, something that finally feels like the start of an honest inheritance, instead of a silent one.